Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to AP US History, as we talk about another great revival in religion, the Second Great Awakening, as well as some other reform movements in the early and mid-1800s that developed from this religious revival, or in some cases simply on their own. Now, one of the dominant philosophies of the mid and late 1700s had been that of the Enlightenment, which emphasized reason over emotion, and had created America's government based on laws rather than the leadership of great men, but laws created by men, not necessarily based directly on the laws of God. Likewise, traditional Christian theology in many parts of America had been austere, focused on church authority, strict morality, and an angry God. Both of these traditions had encouraged people to strive for perfection, even if Christian leaders knew that was a struggle that could never truly succeed. But the stern religious attitudes of many colonial religious leaders had been challenged by the First Great Awakening, and a growing tide of romanticism in the late 17 and early 1800s encouraged people to experience personal emotions rather than be coldly rational. Indeed, the Enlightenment had given us the American Revolution, it's true, but also the French Revolution, where Enlightenment had gone to attack all kinds of traditions. The guillotine had been a tool of the Enlightenment, coldly rational and efficient. So, in the late 1700s, and especially the early 1800s, these trends of both a more personal religion and questioning of the cold rationality of the Enlightenment led many people to want a more personal, emotional relationship with a loving God, while still retaining the notion the world could be improved, possibly even perfected, maybe in time for a new millennium, the return of God's kingdom. And these things would lead to a second Great Awakening in America, perhaps starting as early as the late 1780s, certainly expanding in the very early 1800s, reaching its peak probably in the 1830s. Indeed, the 1830s are viewed by some people as the beginning of the Second Great Awakening, but I think that unfairly ignores some very important influences a bit earlier. The Second Great Awakening particularly affected frontier areas where established churches had less influence to begin with, and less of an established presence, although there are certainly exceptions. Among the first preachers to reach out to these unchurched frontiersmen were the Methodists. The Methodists were famous even in the 1700s for their open-air church services, in part because the traditional Church of England would often not let them preach there, which is one thing that led them to develop into a separate denomination. They're also well known for their circuit riders, preachers who traveled around the country on a regular route to communities too small to support their own ministers. One of the first American Methodist bishops, Francis Asbury, traveled the length of America many times in the late 1700s, including visiting what's now Johnson City in 1788. And in America, the Presbyterians, too, were among the leaders of the early frontier churches, as many of the early settlers were of Scotch-Irish descent, and thus tended to be Presbyterian. And on the frontier, especially in Kentucky, Presbyterian ministers, assisted by Methodists and Baptists, began to hold camp meetings, where thousands of worshipers would come for days to hear series of sermons and be asked to rededicate their lives to God. These were very emotional events, with people feeling touched by the Holy Spirit, some spontaneously jerking around, rolling on the ground, dancing, speaking in tongues, and shouting. Eventually, some ministers, especially Presbyterians, became a bit skeptical of this. They called it acrobatic Christianity, although some changed their minds when they got the jerks themselves. This is sometimes called the Revival of 1800, and so possibly something separate from, but leading into, the Second Great Awakening. Although there were camp meetings both before and after 1800, the largest of these taking place in 1801 at Cane Ridge, Kentucky, under the leadership of Presbyterian minister Barton Stone, who, along with another Presbyterian minister, Alexander Campbell, later left the Presbyterian Church and founded the Christian Church, a church, or they say a movement, intended to unite all different types of Christians into a single movement once again. Although in attempting to unite all Christians, they eventually split into 2 or 3 different branches themselves, the Christian churches, the Churches of Christ, and the Disciples of Christ. Church membership soared in the early 1800s, especially among the Methodists and the Baptists, who before this had been pretty small groups, but became the 2 largest Protestant denominations in America, as they were better at reaching out to frontier areas and more opening of the emotionalism and personal experience of the Second Great Awakening. There were new groups too, as we'll soon see, that developed in this period of religious enthusiasm. As this revival movement continued for decades, again probably reaching its peak in the 1830s, after Charles Grandison Finney, a former lawyer who became a great preacher, held revivals in New York City and then in Rochester in western New York in 1830 and 31, starting a wave of religious enthusiasm in western New York so great that upstate New York came to be called the Burned Over District for the fiery passion of its religious revivals. And this religious revival also sparked a great missionary movement, as missionaries from America, and following kind of similar patterns from Britain, traveled to Africa, to Asia, to Hawaii, and to the American Indian tribes of the West. The missionary movement in China would convert many Chinese people to Christianity and would build a great affection in the minds of many Americans for China for generations to come. Although while many Americans liked China, it would turn out in the late 1800s they did prefer that Chinese people remain in China. And as we'll see later too, descendants of the missionaries who settled in Hawaii would play a major role in its annexation by the United States. So the Second Great Awakening, perhaps even more than the first, definitely even more than the first, emphasized the individual's relationship with God, with personal atonement, personal salvation, and acting out one's beliefs by trying to improve oneself and improve society as a whole. So inspired, on the one hand, a sense of egalitarianism, and also a desire for social reform. And these things, especially the equality inherent in this religious revival, meant that it attracted many women, especially middle-class women. Indeed, women were often the first to feel the Holy Spirit move within them in revivals. And they did the most to increase church membership. Indeed, for many women, especially middle-class women, being active in the church was one of the few socially acceptable ways to really take an active role in society outside the home. One of the places where they can sometimes even take on leadership roles. A few churches, a very few churches, even began to let women preach. So again, the individualistic nature of the Second Great Awakening is one reason that congregationally organized churches like the Baptists and the Christian churches flourished. Each church could define its own beliefs and practices more or less as it pleased, although the centrally organized Methodists certainly grew as well. And the individualism and openness to change in religious practice even led to the development of entirely new denominations. Again, Baptists split into a number of different groups over the 1800s. In the Christian Church, also known as the Stone Campbell movement or the Restoration movement, began officially in 1804, again hoping to unite all Christian denominations into a single movement. And although founded by former Presbyterian ministers, it was based on an attempt to return to basic biblical practices, rejected many traditions and teachings that developed over the years. And one of its big departures was moving away from a Calvinist belief in predestination and coming to believe instead in free will. And while the Methodists were, to begin with, opposed to slavery, they were not always entirely free of racial prejudice. And some African Americans within the Methodist Church felt they were discriminated against, but still wanted to be Methodists, and so founded their own African Methodist Episcopal Church. Other groups, though, developed even more distinctive beliefs, or what some already existing ones became more widespread. The Unitarian Church, for example, developed in the mid-1700s and early 1800s in America and related to a similar movement in England. It grew out of the Congregationalist churches of New England, especially those around Harvard University. They taught that there was one God, a unitary God, not a holy trinity of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. If we are monotheistic, they said, how can we have three different parts of God? Indeed, Jesus, they said, was not the Son of God. He was certainly a great prophet, worthy of imitating, one whose teachings should certainly be followed, but they did not believe that he was the Son of God himself. Unitarians continued to view themselves as Christian, but there were those who questioned if they could truly be Christian if they had not believed in the divinity of Christ. But as the 1800s progressed, particularly in the Second Great Awakening's expansion, many Congregationalist churches became Unitarian, and the Unitarians became a generally rationalist, modernist, intellectual church, although still with a strain of individualistic mysticism, with the individual seeking unity with God. In the mid-1700s, a group had branched away from the Quakers, who came to be known as the Shakers, who got their name, like the Quakers, from their enthusiastic shaking during worship services as they were moved by the Holy Spirit. They even made dancing officially an important part of their worship. Like the Quakers, but to an even greater degree, the Shakers accepted and even encouraged leadership by women. They believed one of their early leaders, Mother Ann Lee, had been a second coming of Christ in female form. The Shakers attracted many people to their faith during the Second Great Awakening, despite their habit of living in fully separate communities dedicated to simple living, hard work, and celibacy, meaning that their communities could only grow through conversion or adoption. And in the 1800s, conversion was quite common, or at least common enough. Later on, adoption remained common, until in the later 20th century, it was made illegal for religious groups to adopt infants. Today, very few Shakers remain. But the idea of creating a separate community dedicated to a particular lifestyle was not unique to the Shakers. It was quite common to many groups in the mid-1800s. In 1833, a Baptist preacher in the burned-over district of New York named William Miller announced a revelation he had received some years ago that Jesus Christ would return to earth in the near future. The second coming was coming. The date was eventually revealed to be October 22nd, 1844. And as that date approached, his followers, known as the Millerites, became more and more numerous as people wanted to be ready for the end of the world, which did not take place on October 22nd, 1844, a non-event known as the Great Disappointment. Millerites had prepared, some by putting on white robes to be dressed for heaven, standing on their roofs so as they flew up into the sky they would not bump their heads. And following this Great Disappointment, the Millerites split into many different groups, some joining other communities like the Quakers and the Shakers, some forming other groups on their own, many still awaiting the end of the world, hopefully in the near future. The most significant of those groups came under the leadership of Mary Ellen White, who began to have visions of her own shortly after the Great Disappointment, of a coming advent, the coming arrival of Jesus Christ. Her followers came to be known as Adventists, or Seventh-day Adventists, and are one of the largest Christian denominations in the world, thanks to a very active missionary movement. They're also one of the healthiest. Among their teachings is an insistence on healthy eating. They prefer complete vegetarianism, although if you can't live up to that, and it's not absolutely required, they do require keeping kosher, following Jewish dietary restrictions. So no bacon for the Adventists. However, a prominent Adventist in the late 1800s by the name of Kellogg developed cereals meant to be a health food for Adventists, but later adopted by others. So enjoy your cornflakes, which you can, thanks to the Great Disappointment, leaving the Adventists behind to develop them for us. But of all the new denominations to appear, by far the largest and most influential today is those who heard the teachings of Joseph Smith. Around 1820, Joseph Smith, a farmer in upstate New York, where it would become the burned-over district, had a vision of angels and Jesus and God, who told him that all existing religious groups were corrupt. And over the years, additional visits by angels showed him the true message he was to preach, eventually guided him to a set of golden plates hidden in a field in New York, plates which he translated with the help of angels. Eventually, once he'd fully translated them, the plates miraculously vanished. But his translation was recorded as another testament of Jesus Christ, also known as the Book of Mormons. And his followers would often be known as Mormons, although they prefer the term Latter-day Saints. Joseph Smith claimed that Jesus, following his death in the Middle East, had appeared to American Indians, bringing Christianity to them, but they had later lost their faith through infighting and corruption. But here was the message once more, a third testament to go along with the Old and New Testaments. And in 1829, Smith and a few others, with whom he'd shared his beliefs privately, began baptizing their followers, again as the Church of Jesus Christ, later called the Latter-day Saints. In some of their early meetings, as one might expect in the Second Great Awakening, there were spells of shouting and speaking in tongues, dancing and fainting, and other acrobatic Christianity. As their church grew, Smith was recognized as an apostle, like St. Peter or St. Paul. But many Christians were not comfortable with the notion of another testament in the Bible, and the Mormons had many new teachings that made people suspicious of them. Their most notorious departure from traditional Christian custom was the practice of plural marriages, described too as polygamy, the possibility of a Mormon man marrying multiple Mormon women. And this was one of many reasons they were often driven from their homes. Although, because Mormons tended to support each other in business and in politics, people too often worried about them dominating the local economy and the local political scene, and that was resented too. So, they were driven west, first from New York, then to Ohio, then to Illinois, then to Missouri, and where their close-knit communities and successful businesses made them seem a threat to local leaders. They often faced violence. In response, they created their own militia, which only made them seem even more threatening and more alien. In 1844, Joseph Smith and his brother were killed by a mob in Illinois. But another leader, eventually determined to be an apostle in his own right, Brigham Young, emerged as a new leader of the church, and 1846 to 47 led his people even further west, to Utah, hoping to create a separate community, possibly a state, maybe even a fully independent country, which they called Deseret, based around Salt Lake City. And despite the harsh climate, their community flourished, which they attributed, of course, to the favor of divine providence. Indeed, as the 1850s progressed, thousands of Mormons went to Utah, making Salt Lake City one of the largest cities west of the Mississippi River. And although the U.S. government recognized Brigham Young as the governor of the Utah Territory, in 1857 to 58, the U.S. government tried to suppress the Mormons by force in the Mormon War, both due to popular outrage at their polygamy and kind of in hopes of distracting the country from the growing crisis over slavery's expansion. The Mormons obviously were not destroyed, although Brigham Young did resign as governor, but still ran things behind the scenes. Despite its growing population, though, Utah was not permitted to become a state all the way till 1896. 6 years after the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints officially ceased to permit any future plural marriages. All some small groups split from the main Mormon Church at that point to retain that practice. Now, the spiritual movements of the period even included a philosophical and literary movement known as transcendentalism, a belief that a person could rise above, could transcend the mundane nature of the world. Among its most popular leaders was Ralph Waldo Emerson, a writer in Massachusetts. And they argued, again, that the most important experiences were individualistic experiences that transcended daily life. Emerson particularly rejected tradition, especially the old, outdated traditions of Europe, which he said Americans should not try to imitate. They promoted self-reliance, self-discipline, a personal quest for spiritual fulfillment, which might be found within a church. So one could be a Christian transcendentalist, especially most likely a Unitarian transcendentalist. But one might transcend this world in the beauty of nature. Nature itself could be your church. Another very well-known transcendentalist writer was Henry David Thoreau, who famously lived in a cabin by Walden Pond near Concord, Massachusetts, practicing self-reliance, living in his own cabin, and in general trying to take care of himself, although it was easier to take care of himself when he frequently had dinner at the home of Ralph Waldo Emerson and Nathaniel Hawthorne, who lived nearby. So maybe less self-reliant than he implied when he published it all in the metaphorical book Walden, or Life in the Woods, again published in 1854, promoting self-reliance even if he had not always been entirely self-reliant, promoting individualism, though he had been very closely supported by a number of his friends. Now, in 1841, 20 Unitarians and Transcendentalists, including the great writer Nathaniel Hawthorne, set up their own experimental community, Brook Farm, near Boston, to try to create a community based on shared values and shared work, with the profits from the farm being shared out amongst those who worked the farm on a communitarian model. Men and women were paid equally. Each person was allowed to work at whatever he or she liked best in hopes of creating a model society. But this did not work out that well. For one thing, most of its members were writers and not farmers, so working what they liked best was not necessarily productive for supporting a distinct community. They didn't manage the place especially well profitably, and they were writers and not businessmen. It was hard to live up to communitarian ideas. Sharing, it turns out, is hard. In 1846, a fire destroyed one of their biggest buildings, and they closed the farm in 1847. This would not be the first or last utopian community founded in America. Indeed, one could say that America as a whole, a republic in an age of monarchies, was a utopian experiment in its own right. One of the most famous utopian communities to be founded in the early 1800s was founded by Robert Owen in 1825. He was a Welsh man who owned a Scottish textile mill. He was a reformer, and he viewed himself as a socialist, again, despite owning a textile mill and employing many workers. And although living in the United Kingdom, land was cheap in Indiana, where he purchased the town of New Harmony with the intent of creating a socialist utopia. He convinced about 1,000 people to settle there, although he himself did not stay very long, and in his absence it was poorly managed. Furthermore, it didn't really have enough skilled craftsmen to be financially successful, and with the work and the profits of the work being shared by all, it turned out that many people wanted to live off the work of others, but still share the profits. So it did not succeed as a socialist experiment, as socialist experiments typically have not. And the experiment ended after just 2 years in 1827, although some of its members remained were very influential in Indiana, particularly in promoting education. The same year that New Harmony was founded, 1825, Fanny Wright founded a community in West Tennessee, not too far from Memphis, known as Nashoba. This was meant to be a place where freed slaves could be educated to prepare them to make their way in the world. Indeed, they believed in full racial equality, in free love, and in atheism, none of which were very popular 13 miles from Memphis, Tennessee. Fanny Wright was also not a businesswoman. Their finances were badly managed. Within a few years, bad management and local hostility caused Nashoba to collapse. Its 31 black members resettled in Haiti. Another religious community founded in the aftermath of the Great Awakening, the Second Great Awakening, was the Oneida community, founded by John Humphrey Noyes in New York. This was also a communal experiment. Property was held in common. The members of Oneida held joint meetings of mutual criticism to help each other become better people. And they practiced complex marriage, which was often described by its opponents as free love, although it was not entirely a free-for-all. Noyes and other leaders of the community determined which members of the community would have sexual relations with others, in particular encouraging big age differences, in which older members would serve as sexual mentors to younger members. In particular, women past childbearing age were encouraged to instruct young men. This was also meant to limit childbearing, which was exhausting and very dangerous, and also was meant to make sure that people who did have children were among the best members of the community, in some ways a selective breeding experiment. And unlike many socialist experiments, they were very successful economically, producing many products that were sold around the country. Animal traps, canned goods, silk, most famously silverware. Oneida silverware would be produced until 2005. So if somewhere around your household or that of a relative there's some Oneida silverware, think of free love during dinner time. Although the production of silverware did last much longer than the practice of free love. Although Noyes was a successful leader in terms of managing his beliefs, after he died, the experiments in free love and mutual criticism soon came to an end. Indeed, Oneida dissolved as a utopian community in 1881, transforming instead into a joint stock company to continue its manufacturing business. Now, many of the churches that grew or were formed during the Second Great Awakening promoted education in order to have ministers of their own and so that church members could read the Bible and other publications of their faith, as many religious denominations opened publishing houses, if they had not already have them, to publish their own Bibles, but all kinds of works, books and pamphlets and newspapers about their religious beliefs. Indeed, a growing number of people believe there ought to be free public schools available to everyone. The first public universities, which is to say founded and funded by the states, were actually founded in the South. The University of Georgia was chartered in 1785, the first public state university, although it took quite a while to actually construct a school and graduate students. The University of North Carolina was chartered in 1789 and became the first to actually graduate students in 1798. The University of Tennessee was founded in 1794, although originally known as Blount College, after the territorial governor, the University of Tennessee being 2 years older than the state of Tennessee. But the movement to create free public schools, or common schools as they were sometimes called, was strongest in the North. These early free schools, at least free to students, were supported by taxation, and early on were pretty limited. But as more tax money was set aside, and primarily in the North, and more government attention paid to them, especially by the Whigs, they grew and grew. And one of the leaders of the common school movement was Horace Mann, who became head of the Massachusetts Board of Education in 1837. In 1839, there's Massachusetts, he helped to found America's first state-supported normal school, a term used in those days and for many years to come for a school designed to train teachers, typically a 2-year college. So called because they followed a standard or normal curriculum. But the idea being that a teacher should be more than just some local person who can read better than most of the kids. Probably a young man waiting his turn for a real job or a young woman waiting her turn to get married. Rather, teaching should be an actual profession with people trained for it in a normal school. Again, Massachusetts in particular, the Northeast in general, were leaders in public education. Although the Northwest Ordinance's requirement that one section out of every 36 be sold to support public education gave help to schools in that region too. In the South, where population was more scattered, and local custom and usually local law denied education to slaves, and where many people just didn't want to pay taxes, it was harder and less popular to support public education. Although Tennessee provided more and better public education than many southern states, although admittedly providing more education than, say, Alabama, is not necessarily bragging that much. But Tennessee did have 2 important governors in promoting education. The great reformer William Carroll, who promoted many reforms in the 1820s and 1830s, having previously been famous for shooting Jesse Benton in the butt in a duel. Later on, Andrew Johnson, as governor of Tennessee, strongly supported public education, he himself never having had any education growing up, teaching himself to read as an adult, being taught math by his wife. From there, he'll go on to the Senate and eventually the vice presidency and presidency of the United States. Although looking back, he was probably much better as governor than as president. A desire to perfect society led to a desire to remove what was coming to be seen as one of society's greatest scourges, of alcohol, which for a long time had simply been part of society. People took a drinking break at work sometime in the late morning. Calling in sick because you were too hungover to work was viewed as acceptable maybe once a week. But now it was seen as a waste of time and of money, an encouragement to sloth and violence. Perhaps even alcohol was a false idol that the drunk worshipped rather than worshiping God. And the temperance movement in America developed out of the Protestant revival of the Second Great Awakening, as moral reformers hoped to limit or completely ban the sale and use of alcohol. One of the most famous early leaders of the temperance movement was Lyman Beecher of Connecticut, a minister who helped to found the American Society for the Promotion of Temperance. This group was founded in Boston in 1826. Lyman Beecher is also famous through 2 of his children, Henry Ward Beecher and Harriet Beecher Stowe, who would later be prominent in the anti-slavery movement. The first state to completely ban the production and sale of alcohol was Maine, which did so in 1851, and a few other northern states followed his example. Although some of these laws were overturned, they were often not widely enforced, as many people did like to drink. But overall, there was probably a decline in alcohol consumption over the course of the 1800s, starting from a point at which the average American consumed at least twice, maybe 4 times, the volume of alcohol that he drinks today. Indeed, one historian writing some decades back described early America as the alcoholic republic. A prison reform movement that in some ways dated to the work of Quakers in Pennsylvania in the mid-1700s now expanded as states began reducing the number of crimes that could earn the death penalty, and some places, very few at first, but some, even tried to rehabilitate prisoners. For the most part, this was not very effective, Jails were overcrowded, easy to escape from. Prisoners were often barely controlled in big common rooms. But in the 1820s, many states, starting with New York, began separating prisoners into cells and prohibiting them from talking most of the time, believing that they would just share wicked ideas. Their days were carefully regimented into times for work, which was seen as a way to build self-discipline and moral character, and also to produce goods that would support the prison, either stuff the prisoners needed or stuff to sell to raise money. There was, of course, time for eating, time for sleeping, time for exercise, all carefully regulated. Uniforms were provided for prisoners to wear. And while the reform movement in prisons in the 1820s began in New York, it was soon imitated around the country, and even in other countries. And over time, whipping, branding, other forms of extreme punishment were banned, such as, say, clipping off people's ears. In 1829, many of these things were banned in Tennessee. Imprisonment for debt came to an end, state by state. And although prisons remain pretty harsh places, in theory at least, and sometimes even in practice, they became places to help criminals reform their lives, become productive members of society, with many prisons also providing standardized time for education and for prayer, along prisoners' other activities. Now, the mentally ill were often treated even worse than prisoners, sometimes simply thrown into prisons to control them, or locked in attics or basements by relatives who did not know how to take care of them, or confined to poor houses, places that counties maintained to house people who could not house themselves. They're often in conditions so filthy the stench could drive away visitors, although people would sometimes visit homes for the mentally ill just to watch them be crazy as a form of entertainment. Most famously, Bethlehem or Bedlam Hospital in London. But in this age of Christian reform, the mentally ill came to be seen as victims rather than monsters, and some people hoped to improve their treatment. One of the most active and famous reformers of insane asylums and prisons was Dorothea Dix, and who traveled the country to investigate and report on the terrible treatment of the mentally ill, and to demand change, which was often brought about, as insane asylums were developed across the country to provide safer places and in some cases even treatment for the mentally ill. Although in some of these insane asylums were not that nice themselves, as several of Dorothea Dix's reports indicated. Tennessee's early one was viewed as pretty bad by Dorothea Dix, so a better one was created. And Dorothea Dix, as you may have noticed, was a woman. Because many reformers, especially in the temperance movement, but in many other movements too, were women, in large part due to women's growing role in churches, which gave them some practice at leadership. And also the growing religious role of women created a sense that women were the more moral sex, and in some ways ought to be the moral leaders of the household, even of society. Men could concentrate on being political and business leaders. This was part of a growing cult of domesticity. They encouraged women to be good housewives and mothers, building a nurturing home life for their families, serving as the conscience of their families, their communities, perhaps even the nation. An updated idea of the Republican motherhood, that good mothers should raise good citizens. All this did largely apply to middle and upper class women, many lower class women still having to work outside the home to support their families. But for middle and upper class women, being at home was seen as their primary role, but promoting reform as kind of an act of being the social conscience in this religious age was one thing a middle or upper class woman could do outside the home that was socially acceptable. And women could also do more because they had more opportunities for education, as women's colleges were founded in America. Emma Willard founded the first women's college in America, called at first Troy Female Seminary, founded in 1814 in Troy, New York, although not holding their first classes until 1821. It still exists, although is known as Emma Willard School today in honor of their founder. Other women's schools began to open over time, particularly in New England. In 1837, Oberlin College in Ohio, under the presidency of the Great Awakening preacher Charles Finney, began to admit female students to Oberlin College alongside male ones. They had begun admitting black students in 1835. So by the late 1830s, they did not discriminate, at least in admissions, based on either race or sex. Such discrimination being viewed by Charles Grandison Finney and many, although definitely not all, other leaders of the Second Great Awakening as inappropriate for Christians. And in this cult of domesticity and female education were partly possible because, as I've already hinted at, a middle class was growing in America who could economically afford for the woman of the household not to work for profit. Indeed, not having to have the woman of the family work was one of the most basic elements of being middle class. So this gave well-educated, financially stable, middle-class women the time and the ability to push for reform in schools, in temperance, in prisons, and insane asylums, and even for their own rights. Many of the early crusaders for women's rights were Quakers, who were already accustomed to equality between the sexes in their own families and meeting houses. One of the first prominent women's rights activists was Lucretia Mott, who had been inspired by the role women were playing in the anti-slavery movement in Britain. In America, she began to work with Elizabeth Cady Stanton, another fairly early and very long-serving leader in the women's movement. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was married. She was the mother of 7 children, but in her marriage she insisted the word obey be omitted from her wedding vows. She would love and honor her husband, but did not swear to obey him. Indeed, she went so far as to insist on women's suffrage, at a time when even many women were not prepared to ask for the right to vote. In her demands for suffrage, she was joined by the Quaker Susan B. Anthony, who became the most visible supporter of women's suffrage of all, in part because as a Quaker she did have fairly conventional religious views. Elizabeth Cady Stanton came to have some views seen as kind of strange, even publishing her own Woman's Bible, taking out the parts of the Bible she disagreed with. So Anthony was perhaps more acceptable to many Americans. Indeed, so visibly associated with the movement that when the 19th Amendment gave women the right to vote in 1920, it was sometimes known as the Susan B. Anthony Amendment. And Susan B. Anthony would later become the first real woman, as opposed to, say, an allegorical depiction of Lady Liberty, to appear on an American coin, the U.S. dollar from 1979 to 1999. In 1848, supporters of the women's movement, as it was typically called then, met at Seneca Falls, New York, for what's called the Women's Rights Convention, or typically just the Seneca Falls Convention, where, among other things, they issued a Declaration of Rights and Sentiments, borrowing much of its language from America's Declaration of Independence, saying, among other things, that they held these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal. And they declared they did not owe allegiance to the United States government until that government represented them by recognizing their right to vote and their equality in all ways under the law. Although honestly not much came of this at the time, it is often viewed, at least symbolically, as the beginning of the women's rights movement in America. Although in the first 2/3 of the 19th century, arguably for most of the 19th century, the women's movement did not accomplish a whole lot in the United States, although partly this is because women of the time spread their efforts across many different reform movements. And of the women who really wanted to push for equal rights, many of them put their greatest efforts to helping a group who were seen as having it even worse than being a woman. Because even worse than being a woman was being a slave. and so many women reformers put their greatest efforts into the anti-slavery movement.